Picture the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana during the bleak twilight of November 1877. The sky above the Mission Mountains had turned the color of bruised slate, heavy with the weight of an approaching northern plains winter. Across the valley floor, seasoned frontiersmen were breaking their backs in a frantic race against the cold. They were hauling the final loads of split pine into thick timber cabins, sealing horizontal log seams with wet river clay, and sharpening broadaxes to chop through endless cords of hard timber. These were tough, practical men who believed in brute force, heavy wood, and massive stone fireplaces. To them, survival in Montana was a battle of endurance, fought with iron tools and muscle. Yet right at the edge of the settlement, near present-day Stevensville, one man was doing something that struck every observer as sheer madness. Thomas Whitfield, a 34-year-old trapper originally from Pennsylvania, was erecting what the local homesteaders scoffed at as a wild, flimsy circus tent. It was a conical structure constructed from heavy cotton canvas and tanned elk hide stretched over slender lodge poles. To the carpenters and Civil War veterans building stout cabins nearby, Whitfield looked like a doomed fool. He had no thick timber walls, no iron stove, and no massive stone chimney to shelter him from the coming frost. A master carpenter named Jacob Hensley, who had personally constructed 17 log cabins across the territory, paused his work, leaned heavily on his felling axe, and spat into the freezing grass. He muttered to the men standing nearby that the fool in the rag tent would freeze to death before Christmas. He warned that canvas held no heat worth a damn, and that when the true Canadian blizzards came roaring down the mountain passes, Whitfield would be begging on his knees for a spot on a real cabin floor. The other settlers nodded in grim agreement. They had invested weeks of exhausting physical labor into their log homesteads. Some had built walls 14 inches thick, set deep foundations of heavy river stone, and hired skilled masons from Ohio and Pennsylvania to construct fireplaces capable of holding massive timber logs. In their eyes, Whitfield's dwelling looked like an abandoned campsite waiting for a hard frost to sweep it away. What those experienced frontier builders completely failed to realize was that Thomas Whitfield was not relying on guesswork or luck. He was quietly applying principles of thermal engineering and atmospheric physics that the white settlers had never even considered. While the cabin builders were trying to overpower nature through sheer volume of wood and heavy timber, Whitfield was harnessing air gaps, convective flow, radiant heat storage, and aerodynamic geometry. When the historic blizzard of January 1878 finally slammed into the Bitterroot Valley, dropping ambient temperatures to a bone-crushing minus 38 degrees Fahrenheit, the reality on the ground shattered every expectation. Inside the thick log cabins, families were shivering uncontrollably. Their massive stone chimneys were acting like giant suction pumps, pulling frigid air through every tiny crack in the chinked walls, burning over 400 pounds of firewood every 24 hours, just to keep the interior floor barely above freezing. Meanwhile, inside Thomas Whitfield's canvas and hide dwelling, the scene was almost impossible to comprehend. While the wind howled outside at gale force, Whitfield was sitting comfortably in his shirt sleeves, calmly scraping a beaver pelt. His interior thermometer read a steady, comfortable 68 degrees Fahrenheit. He was maintaining a 97-degree temperature difference between the interior of his shelter and the frozen hell outside, while burning less than 1/5 of the firewood consumed by his neighbors. His small, modest fire burned for just 6 hours a day, while the heavy stone pit beneath it slowly radiated warmth all through the night. Before we step into the heart of this relentless storm and uncover the exact physical measurements that proved the frontier builders catastrophically wrong, take a quick second to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below letting me know where you are watching from and what the coldest winter night you have ever experienced was in your corner of the world. Because what you are about to learn is not just forgotten frontier history, it is pure survival knowledge that reveals how ancient science can completely outperform modern brute force. The collision of cultures in the Bitterroot Valley was as predictable as it was intense. Thomas Whitfield had arrived in Montana Territory in the early spring of 1877, following the clear, cold beaver streams that carved their way through the Mission Mountains. Unlike the homesteaders flooding westward with land claims, heavy iron plows, and dreams of building permanent farming townships, Whitfield was a man who moved quietly between two very different worlds. Over the previous 3 winters, he had lived among the Cheyenne and the Blackfeet in Wyoming Territory. He had not merely observed their way of life from a distance. He had studied their techniques, analyzed their materials, and paid close attention to the structural mechanics of their winter encampments. When Whitfield pitched his modified conical lodge on a patch of high ground near the edge of the Stevensville settlement, the local response was immediate and mockingly hostile. Henry Bradshaw, a former Union Army quartermaster who had spent the Civil War supervising the construction of heavy timber winter barracks in Virginia, stood on his porch and openly ridiculed the trapper. Bradshaw boasted to the townspeople that he had supervised real military construction, and that watching a grown man try to winter in an Indian lodge, while sensible folks were cutting cords of pine, was like watching a child try to build a house out of straw. Bradshaw's own log cabin was a showcase of conventional 19th-century frontier wisdom. It measured 12 feet by 16 feet, framed with interlocked spruce logs notched precisely at the corners. The gaps between the heavy timbers were chinked with a dense paste of river mud, wild moss, and wood shavings. At the far end stood a massive stone fireplace that consumed a quarter cord of split pine every 36 hours. By all standard architectural metrics of 1877 Montana, Bradshaw had built a fortress. It was heavy, solid, and designed to withstand the physical impact of heavy snowfall. Whitfield's structure looked laughably delicate by comparison. It was a simple cone, measuring approximately 16 feet in diameter at the base and rising 14 feet to an open smoke hole at the peak. The outer skin was heavy cotton duck canvas that he had traded for at Fort Benton, but it was what lay beneath that canvas skin that baffled and amused the settlers. Suspended 18 inches inside the outer canvas wall was a second, separate inner wall made of soft, tanned elk hide. This inner liner ran from ground level up to a height of about 7 feet, held in place by leather thongs tied to the slender lodge poles. Samuel Morton, a neighboring homesteader, who had cleared 43 standing pine trees just to build the walls of his rectangular cabin, walked over one afternoon to inspect the trapper's work. Morton ran his hand over the double layer, shook his head, and laughed out loud. He asked Whitfield if he was doubling up his walls because he did not trust his own canvas to keep the rain out, joking that the whole contraption looked like a glorified circus tent that would leak cold air like a wicker basket. Whitfield barely looked up from his work. He was not interested in winning verbal arguments. He was focused on physical geometry and thermodynamic laws. He had aligned the entrance of his lodge precisely to the east, angling it away from the prevailing northwest gales that blew down from the mountain passes. The ground beneath the structure had been carefully excavated down 8 inches below the natural frost line. Whitfield had lined this shallow, circular floor with smooth, flat river stones gathered from the creek bed. Over the stones, he laid a dense layer of dried prairie grass, followed by heavy buffalo robes and topped with tightly woven willow mats. Each floor layer was deliberately selected to prevent conductive heat loss from the human body into the frozen earth below. At the exact geometric center of the lodge sat the fire pit. It was placed precisely 127 inches from every surrounding wall. Rather than digging a simple hole in the dirt, Whitfield had constructed a circular ring of heavy, high-density river stones. These were not porous sandstone or brittle slate, which could crack or explode when exposed to intense heat, but dense basalt and granite rocks that he had tested and chosen specifically for their thermal mass properties. Henry Bradshaw stopped by again late one November afternoon, watching Whitfield painstakingly arrange his circular ring of creek stones. Bradshaw sneered, asking if Whitfield honestly expected to heat a massive canvas tent in the middle of a northern winter with a fire no larger than a cooking hearth. Bradshaw warned him that by January, when the real cold set in, he would be begging for a corner near a real cabin stove. Whitfield simply looked at the retired quartermaster, smiled quietly, and said they would see what January brought when the mountain storms arrived. What Thomas Whitfield understood, and what the cabin builders were completely blind to, was a fundamental law of nature. Heating a shelter in extreme cold is not about building the biggest fire or consuming the most wood. It is about managing heat movement across three distinct physical pathways: conduction, convection, and radiation. The traditional log cabins of the American frontier were, in truth, thermodynamic disasters. Though their builders took enormous pride in the thickness of their walls, every single horizontal log served as a direct thermal bridge. Wood is an insulator along its grain, but across its cross-section, heat travels through timber toward the cold exterior at a surprising rate. Furthermore, as the green logs dried and settled over the autumn months, the wood shrank, creating thousands of microscopic fissures in the clay chinking. These tiny gaps allowed frigid outside air to enter constantly, driven by atmospheric pressure differences. The internal geometry of the cabins made the problem even worse. Square corners created stagnant dead air zones where convective air currents died completely. In those cold, dark corners, heavy frost accumulated on the inside of the logs, growing thicker with every passing week. But the greatest engineering flaw of all was the massive stone fireplace. Built against an exterior wall, these imposing structures acted like giant heat sinks in reverse. Over 60% of the thermal energy produced by the burning logs was drawn directly up the stone chimney and vented out into the freezing night sky. Worse still, as the hot air rushed up the chimney, it created a powerful draft that turned the cabin into a vacuum pump, actively sucking frozen air inside through every microscopic seam in the walls. Whitfield's conical lodge operated on an entirely different set of physical laws. The cone shape completely eliminated rectangular corners, allowing air to circulate smoothly without creating dead, frozen pockets. As thermal energy rose from the central fire pit, it moved naturally up toward the apex of the structure. Instead of escaping through a wide, roaring chimney, the smoke and warm air passed through an adjustable smoke hole, barely 14 inches across. This opening was carefully controlled by two exterior canvas flaps, managed with long wooden poles. The smoke hole was sized to create just enough upward draft to carry away smoke, but small enough to trap the vast majority of the rising warm air inside the lodge. The true masterstroke of native engineering, however, was the double wall system. The 18-inch air gap between the outer canvas skin and the inner hide liner created a controlled convective loop that modern architects now call a dynamic buffer zone. Cold air infiltrating through the outer canvas was captured in this middle space. As air descended between the two layers, it was pre-warmed by radiant heat, transferring through the inner hide liner before it ever reached the actual living area. The inner liner itself was suspended using an ancient technique passed down by Plains tribes. It was anchored tightly to the lodge poles near the top, but hung completely free at the bottom, hovering just 2 inches above the ground mats. This created a self-regulating thermal siphon. Cool air at floor level was drawn into the bottom of the air gap, warmed as it rose between the inner and outer walls, and then recirculated back into the center of the lodge at the top. The interior living space was shielded from direct drafts, while maintaining a continuous supply of fresh, pre-warmed oxygen for breathing and combustion. The central fire pit contributed another massive physical advantage. In a rectangular log cabin with a fireplace built into one wall, heat radiated in a single direction, leaving the opposite side of the room freezing cold. Whitfield's central hearth radiated heat evenly across 360 degrees. Every square inch of the lodge received equal radiant energy. Furthermore, the 240 pounds of dense river rock lining the pit acted as an off-grid thermal battery. During active burning, these heavy basalt stones absorbed massive amounts of heat. Long after the flames died down to glowing embers, the stones slowly released that stored energy back into the living space for 8 to 10 consecutive hours. The geometric efficiency was equally stark when calculated by volume. Whitfield's lodge, with its 16-foot diameter base and 14-foot peak height, enclosed a total volume of approximately 940 cubic feet of air. Henry Bradshaw's 12 by 16-foot cabin, with its flat 8-foot ceiling, contained over 1,440 cubic feet of space. Bradshaw was attempting to heat over 50% more air volume within a poorly insulated, leaky box that actively pulled draft through its walls. Whitfield was heating a compact, mathematically optimized cone wrapped in an insulating air blanket that retained every single British thermal unit of energy his fire produced. Yet despite these obvious physical principles, trying to explain thermodynamics to 19th century frontiersmen was nearly impossible. These were men who had built cabins the same way their fathers and grandfathers had built them in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and Virginia. They viewed any deviation from heavy timber construction not as innovation but as proof of ignorance or laziness. When Bradshaw walked past the lodge again in early December, watching Whitfield adjust the draft flaps on his outer canvas skin, he scoffed once more. He told the trapper that he was just making extra work for himself with all that complicated rigging and double layering. Bradshaw declared that thick spruce logs and a roaring oak fire were all a real man needed to survive a Montana winter, advice he intended to stick to regardless of what Whitfield was doing in his tent. Whitfield listened patiently, said nothing in return, and gently placed another split log onto his central fire pit. He knew that arguing with proud men was a waste of breath. The true test was coming, and he was content to let the Montana winter settle the debate once and for all. On January 12, 1878, the weather broke. A catastrophic Arctic cold front came screaming down out of western Canada, sweeping across the plains and slamming into the Bitterroot Valley with devastating force. Veterans who had lived in the territory for over 20 years admitted they had never seen a storm hit with such sudden, deadly ferocity. Within 12 hours, the sky turned into a blinding white maelstrom, and the ambient temperature plummeted to a terrifying -38 degrees Fahrenheit. The cold was so extreme that physical materials began to fail in bizarre, frightening ways. Human breath froze into solid ice crystals on whiskers and collar fabric before it could even leave a man's lips. Deep inside the surrounding pine forests, the natural sap inside standing timber froze solid, expanded rapidly, and shattered the tree trunks with deafening cracks that sounded like cannon fire echoing across the valley. To step outside without thick wool mittens and heavy hide wraps meant suffering severe frostbite within minutes. Inside the log cabins of the settlement, absolute desperation took hold almost immediately. At Jacob Hensley's home, the cold invaded the living space like an invading army. Hensley and his sons worked feverishly, shoving split pine into their stone fireplace around the clock. In a desperate attempt to stay warm, they burned an entire cord of seasoned firewood in just 70 hours. Yet, despite maintaining a roaring, violent fire that threw sparks high above the chimney, the interior temperature of the cabin hovered at a brutal 23 degrees Fahrenheit. Ice formed on the interior surface of the log walls, creeping across the clay, chinking in elaborate, shimmering crystalline patterns. Hensley's wife and children slept wrapped in every garment they owned, piled beneath 4 layers of heavy buffalo robes, shivering violently as the Arctic wind blew through tiny gaps in the walls. The air near the floor was so cold that a bucket of fresh river water, set just 6 feet from the glowing fireplace hearth, froze solid overnight into a thick block of ice. Henry Bradshaw's situation was even more perilous. His massive stone chimney, fed continuously with heavy split pine and aspen logs, created a powerful thermal draft. But that intense updraft acted like an industrial exhaust fan, creating severe negative air pressure inside the cabin. Frigid draft was pulled violently through every unsealed seam in the timber walls. The larger Bradshaw built his fire, the faster the cabin sucked in -38-degree air from outside. By the second night of the Arctic gale, ice had formed on his kitchen table, and Bradshaw was forced to drag his mattress within 3 feet of the open fire pit just to keep his blood circulating. Over at Samuel Morton's cabin, the man who had boasted about clearing 43 massive spruce trees was facing a severe fuel crisis. Morton was out in his shed chopping frozen timber with numb, bleeding fingers. As he swung his axe through the iron-hard wood, he calculated with growing panic that his carefully stacked woodpile, which he had assumed would last the entire winter, would be completely exhausted in less than a week if the storm held. If his fuel ran out before the Arctic front broke, his family would freeze to death inside their solid timber walls. On the morning of January 14th, after 3 endless days of blinding snowfall, the Arctic winds briefly subsided, leaving behind a stillness that was cold enough to kill. Jacob Hensley, wrapped in heavy wool blankets and wearing thick hide boots, decided to pull himself through the hip-deep snowdrifts to check on the foolish trapper who had chosen to winter in a canvas tent. Hensley fully expected to find a frozen corpse inside a collapsed shelter. As he trudged across the buried settlement, Hensley looked toward Whitfield's camp and paused in absolute shock. Rising lazily from the peak of the canvas lodge was a thin, almost invisible wispy trail of gray smoke. It was a modest draft, suggesting a tiny, controlled fire, nothing like the violent, roaring plumes of dark smoke pouring from the chimneys of the log cabins nearby. Hensley approached the entrance, his boots crunching loudly in the frozen crust. He reached out with a gloved hand and pushed aside the heavy outer canvas flap. The moment he stepped across the threshold, the change in temperature hit him like a physical wall of heat. The cold air evaporated instantly, replaced by a deep, enveloping warmth that smelled faintly of sweet smoke, cedar wood, and dried prairie grass. Inside, Thomas Whitfield was sitting comfortably on a woven willow mat, wearing only his cottonwork shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. He was calmly scraping a beaver hide held in a wooden frame. The interior of the lodge was so warm, so completely insulated from the freezing storm outside, that Whitfield had actually rolled up the bottom 6 inches of his inner hide liner to allow cool, fresh air to circulate across the floor mats. Hensley stood frozen in the doorway, his jaw hanging open in utter disbelief. He looked around the room, staring at the canvas walls, the slender wooden poles, and the modest ring of creek stones in the center of the room. The only word he could manage to speak was a breathless question: how? Whitfield smiled, set down his scraping iron, and pointed toward a small brass thermometer hanging from one of the central lodge poles. Hensley stepped closer, squinting through the dim light to read the glass tube. The mercury rested steadily at 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the ambient temperature on the valley floor was still hovering at a brutal minus 29 degrees Fahrenheit. That meant Thomas Whitfield was maintaining a 97-degree temperature difference between the interior of his canvas shelter and the freezing Arctic air outside. And he was doing it with a central hearth that consumed barely 12 pounds of wood an hour, burning for only 6 hours a day. Hensley stared at the small glowing embers resting inside the circular ring of river stones. He remarked in astonishment that the fire was barely burning at all. Whitfield nodded calmly, explaining that the fire did not need to roar. The heavy creek stones absorbed the energy, while the fire was lit and held onto it for hours. The conical shape guided the warm air evenly across the room, while the double wall gap trapped the heat before it could escape into the canvas. Whitfield revealed that he had been sitting comfortably in his shirt sleeves for 3 straight days, using a total of 72 pounds of firewood over 72 hours. Hensley quickly ran the numbers through his head, comparing Whitfield's fuel use to his own. Over those same 3 days, Hensley had burned over 800 pounds of prime split pine, and his family was still shivering inside a 23-degree cabin. The mathematical reality was undeniable. The flimsy, scoffed-at tent was outperforming every solid log cabin in the Bitterroot Valley by every single measurable metric of thermal efficiency. Hensley looked at the trapper, his voice trembling slightly from a mix of exhaustion and newfound respect. He told Whitfield that he needed to show this to Henry Bradshaw, to Samuel Morton, and to every homesteader in the valley. Word of the impossible canvas lodge spread through the snowbound settlement within hours. By nightfall, 7 hardened frontiersmen had pulled themselves through the deep snowdrifts to witness the miracle for themselves. They stood inside Whitfield's warm, comfortable lodge, staring at the thermometer, feeling the gentle radiant heat flowing from the creek stones, and realizing that their centuries-old assumptions about winter survival had been completely shattered by physical reality. Within a week of that legendary storm, the casual skepticism that had dominated the Bitterroot Valley dissolved into stunned, quiet acceptance. The frontier homesteaders were practical men at heart. When faced with cold, hard physical evidence, they could no longer deny the truth staring them in the face. Henry Bradshaw, the former quartermaster who had spent his entire military career trusting official Army construction manuals, was the first to demand precise documentation. He refused to rely on rumors or campfire-exaggerated stories. Bradshaw returned to Thomas Whitfield's lodge on a bitter afternoon in late January, carrying his own calibrated brass thermometer and a leather-bound logbook. He spent 6 continuous hours taking thermal readings, weighing fuel inputs on a grain scale, and comparing the performance of Whitfield's conical shelter directly against his own stout log cabin. Here is what everyone had missed, and the numbers that Bradshaw recorded in his leather book were devastating to conventional frontier wisdom. While the ambient outside air hovered around -25 degrees Fahrenheit, Whitfield's lodge maintained an interior average of 68 degrees Fahrenheit, gently wavering between 64 and 72 degrees, depending on active burning in the central pit. Over at Bradshaw's cabin, despite maintaining a roaring hearth that required constant attention, the living area averaged between 23 and 31 degrees Fahrenheit, with violent fluctuations depending on how close a person stood to the fireplace. When Bradshaw weighed the fuel, the cold, hard truth became impossible to ignore. To maintain his frigid cabin floor, Bradshaw was burning a minimum of 360 pounds of split pine every 24 hours, and neighboring homesteaders like Samuel Morton were consuming over 425 pounds due to their larger interior space. Whitfield, by contrast, burned precisely 144 pounds of mixed pine and aspen twigs over the same 24-hour period. Think about that for a second. The trapper was achieving living conditions 40 to 45 degrees warmer while consuming over 60% less timber. The most shocking metric in Bradshaw's notes came from heat retention testing after the fires were completely extinguished. Bradshaw instructed Whitfield to let his central hearth die down to cold ashes at midnight. In the log cabins across the valley, when a fireplace went out, interior temperatures collapsed below 40 degrees Fahrenheit within 90 minutes to 2 hours, as heat bled directly through the horizontal logs and out the wide chimney. In Whitfield's lodge, however, 6 hours after the fire had died completely, the interior thermometer still registered 55 degrees Fahrenheit. The secret lay entirely in thermal mass storage. The 240 pounds of dense creek stones forming the central pit had absorbed thermal energy during active burning and were now slowly releasing it into the sealed interior. Those river rocks were operating exactly like an off-grid thermal battery, dispensing energy when it was needed most. Furthermore, Bradshaw documented extreme thermal stratification inside the square log cabins. In Samuel Morton's home, the temperature near the ceiling measured 62 degrees Fahrenheit, while the floor level just 8 feet below measured 28 degrees Fahrenheit. That 34-degree vertical difference meant hot air was trapped uselessly against the rafters, while the family's feet were freezing on the floor mats. Inside Whitfield's conical lodge, the temperature difference between the floor level and head height was less than 4 degrees. The continuous convective loop created by the double wall system kept warm air gently moving throughout the living space, without letting it stagnate at the top or escape through structural leaks. Sitting inside the lodge, on the afternoon of January 23rd, Samuel Morton ran his hand over the warm river stones, looked at Whitfield, and asked the question that had been weighing on every settler's mind. Why had none of them known about this engineering before? Whitfield fed another modest split of pine into the hearth and gave an answer that silenced the room. He explained that the settlers had operated under the flawed assumption that people who had inhabited the northern plains for thousands of years had never figured out basic structural mechanics. The homesteaders assumed that thick spruce logs equaled superior insulation, completely blind to the fact that horizontal wood acts as a thermal bridge, conducting interior warmth straight out to the frozen winter sky. They assumed massive fireplaces created more heat, failing to realize those heavy stone structures were venting 60% of their energy straight into the clouds while sucking frigid air through every wall seam. Whitfield told them plainly that the Blackfeet, the Cheyenne, and the Lakota had solved these thermodynamic challenges generations ago. They had refined their architectural principles through centuries of relentless testing in the harshest winter conditions on Earth. They simply had not recorded their scientific breakthroughs in published books or European building codes, leading the arrogant settlers to dismiss their deep environmental knowledge as primitive living. And that is when everything changed in the Bitterroot Valley. By late February 1878, as the heavy mountain snows began their slow retreat, the question among the homesteaders was no longer whether Whitfield's canvas and hide shelter worked. The only question that mattered was how fast the entire community could learn to replicate native engineering before the next winter hit. Spring arrived in Montana territory with a gentle golden warmth that made the brutal frost of January feel like a distant memory. But the terrifying lessons of the Great Storm had left a permanent mark on the minds of the settlers. On March 17th, Jacob Hensley walked up to Whitfield's camp with a request that would have been unimaginable just 5 months earlier. Hensley asked the trapper to teach him how to build a proper conical shelter from scratch, explaining that he wanted his teenage sons to understand that there was more than one way to survive on the frontier. Whitfield looked at the veteran carpenter and told him honestly that he needed to learn from builders far more skilled than himself. The true engineering wisdom belonged to the native tribes who had perfected the design over countless generations. Within 2 weeks, Whitfield helped organize an unprecedented cultural and technical exchange near the Jocko River, just north of the settlement. 3 respected Blackfeet elders, 2 guns, Standing Wolf, and a skilled craftsman named Beaver Woman agreed to demonstrate authentic lodge construction techniques in exchange for iron tools, wool blankets, and grain rations. What followed over the next several days was a masterclass in structural mechanics and thermodynamics that changed the valley forever. Beaver Woman began the instruction by demonstrating the precise installation of the inner liner, emphasizing that the entire thermal efficiency of the structure depended on this single component. Using a teaching lodge, erected specifically for the demonstration, she showed the attentive settlers how the inner skin had to remain completely unattached at the ground level. She explained that if a builder tied down the bottom of the liner, they killed the convective air movement, trapping moisture and stopping the pre-warming cycle. The air had to flow freely beneath the liner to create the dynamic insulation barrier that kept drafts away from the living floor. Next, Standing Wolf taught the mathematics of timber selection and pole geometry. He instructed the settlers to seek out 15 straight, slender lodgepole pines for a 16-foot dwelling, each pole measuring precisely 22 feet in length. The base of each pole had to be peeled clean of bark and fire-hardened over open coals to prevent decay and insect damage. Standing Wolf then demonstrated how to tie the foundational tripod using a specialized hide knot, setting the poles at an exact angle of 67 degrees relative to the earth. He warned the homesteaders that the angle was non-negotiable. If the walls were set too steep, heavy mountain winds would push smoke back down the peak into the living area. If the pitch was set too shallow, interior heat would vent too quickly through the apex opening, destroying the shelter's thermal mass retention. Finally, 2 guns led the instruction on hearth engineering and thermal battery construction. He took the settlers down to the riverbed, showing them how to select the proper stones by density and weight rather than appearance. He pointed out smooth, heavy river rocks of basalt and granite that could absorb extreme heat without cracking, while warning them away from porous sandstone and river shale that held hidden moisture and could explode when heated. 2 guns demonstrated how to arrange the river rocks into 2 distinct concentric rings. The outer ring was built using flat, angled stones designed to reflect radiant energy horizontally back into the living room, preventing heat from sinking uselessly into the cold dirt floor. The inner ring was constructed with heavy, rounded river boulders meant to act as the primary thermal storage battery. 2 guns held up a heavy basalt rock, looked at Jacob Hensley, and told him that every single stone had a specific job to perform, and that nothing in the lodge was built by accident. By late May 1878, 7 homesteader families in the Stevensville area had begun construction on modified winter lodges based directly on the Blackfeet instruction. They did not abandon their timber cabins entirely. The wooden buildings were repurposed as summer quarters, grain storage sheds, and livestock barns. But for pure cold weather survival, the thermal performance of the conical lodge was far too superior to ignore. Henry Bradshaw embraced the new engineering with military thoroughness. He built a 16-foot diameter lodge using 22-foot lodge poles, adhering strictly to Standing Wolf's pole arrangement and Beaver Woman's double-wall suspension instructions. He constructed his hearth using 267 pounds of dense river basalt gathered from the creek. When the first sharp frost of autumn arrived in November 1878, dropping outside temperatures to 4 degrees Fahrenheit, Bradshaw recorded the results in his logbook with quiet triumph. His new lodge maintained a steady interior temperature of 61 degrees Fahrenheit using a modest hearth, cutting his fuel consumption to nearly one-third of what his timber cabin had required the previous year. He wrote in the margin of his journal that the efficiency of the native design was simply undeniable. Samuel Morton took a hybrid approach to the problem. Unwilling to dismantle his massive timber home, Morton attempted to modify his cabin by installing an interior canvas liner 18 inches inside his log walls to create an artificial air gap while keeping his original stone fireplace. The results were measurable but modest, producing roughly a 15% increase in heat retention. Morton quickly learned that while an air gap helped, the square geometry of his cabin still created cold dead corners that disrupted continuous airflow, proving that rectangular architecture could never truly match the fluid convective properties of a conical dome. By the time the winter of 1878 into 1879 settled over western Montana, 23 modified lodges, based on indigenous thermal principles, were in active use across a 50-mile radius of the Bitterroot Valley. The local trading post in Stevensville began stocking heavy canvas duck specifically for lodge liners, and a local carpenter named William Jessup started a thriving business offering peeled, fire-hardened lodge poles to arriving settlers. Stay with me here, because what happened next went far beyond structural engineering and building metrics. The survival revolution, sparked by Thomas Whitfield, began to melt decades of deep-seated cultural prejudice. Homesteaders who had previously viewed Native Americans through a lens of fear and conflict were forced to recognize them as master engineers, brilliant architects, and keepers of sophisticated scientific knowledge that European universities had failed to grasp. While racial tensions and frontier conflicts still existed across the broader territory, within this particular valley, at this critical moment in history, the raw necessity of winter survival built a lasting bridge between two worlds. Two Guns summarized the transformation during a visit to the settlement in December 1878, noting with quiet humor that the white settlers had initially thought the Blackfeet were primitive for living in hidehouses, while the Blackfeet had thought the settlers were foolish for burning whole forests just to stay cold inside wooden boxes. Now that both sides had measured the thermal results, real learning could finally begin. The ultimate validation of this new wisdom came during the severe Arctic surge of January 1879, when temperatures once again plunged below -30 degrees Fahrenheit for a week straight. This time, there was no panic in the Bitterroot Valley. Families living in the modified lodges weathered the brutal freeze with complete confidence. Their woodpiles, which would have been completely depleted under old cabin usage, remained stocked throughout the winter. Children slept comfortably on dry willow mats, and no family faced the terrifying prospect of freezing inside their own home. A teenage boy named Peter Hensley, the son of carpenter Jacob Hensley, recorded the impact of the shift in his personal diary on January 9, 1879. He wrote that his father had told him that true learning was not about blindly sticking to what you were raised to believe, but having the humility to recognize when someone else possessed a better answer. Peter noted that the Blackfeet had not merely shared a clever survival trick. They had taught the settlers a masterclass in thermal mechanics that the homesteaders had been too proud to see. This historical saga is far more than a story about shelter construction in 19th century Montana. It is a powerful reminder of what happens when human beings replace cultural arrogance with intellectual humility. The frontier settlers who initially mocked Thomas Whitfield's canvas tent were not foolish men. They were simply blinded by an unexamined framework that equated European methods with automatic superiority. It required a physical crisis, a relentless Arctic blizzard, with temperatures that could be measured on a thermometer and wood consumption, that could be weighed on a scale to break through that defensive pride and reveal the truth. Modern off-grid builders, homesteaders, and survival specialists can draw profound lessons from both sides of this Montana story. True engineering brilliance is not defined by the thickness of your walls, the weight of your materials, or the brute force of your heating systems. Real efficiency comes from understanding natural laws, conduction, convection, radiation, and thermal mass storage, and working in harmony with those physical principles rather than trying to overpower them. The Blackfeet, Cheyenne, and Lakota nations had conducted the longest thermal engineering experiment in North American history, refining their architectural solutions across hundreds of generations in some of the most unforgiving winter climates on Earth. Every pole angle, every liner gap, and every river stone served a precise, calculated purpose designed to preserve human life with minimal resource consumption. When we take the time to study traditional knowledge with open minds and honest measurements, we often discover that the hardest problems we face today have already been solved by those who came before us. Educational note: this script presents historically inspired reconstructions and thermodynamic analysis for educational and storytelling purposes. Any modern application of off-grid heating, shelter construction, or masonry heat storage should be evaluated according to current local building codes, structural engineering standards, and modern fire safety guidelines.